So, how did we get from the simple personal teachings of Jesus to, well, to some really complex theological doctrines? That's the core question we're tackling today. We're going to trace the journey of how God went from being understood in a deeply personal way to something of a philosophical mystery. Okay, so our starting point is this really famous quote from St. Athanasius. He was a giant in early Christianity. He said, "Orthodoxy is what Christ taught, the apostles preached, and the fathers kept." And, on the surface, that sounds super straightforward, right? It paints this picture of a perfect, unbroken chain stretching all the way from Jesus himself to the church leaders who came way, way later. But is that actually true? That's the big question for this whole explainer. Does that claim really hold up under scrutiny? Did Jesus actually teach the complex ideas that we now call orthodoxy? All right, so here's our game plan. We're going to start by digging into that foundational claim. Then we need to figure out what orthodoxy even means. After that, we'll look at what Christ and the apostles actually taught. From there, we'll trace this huge philosophical shift, ask a pretty critical question about authority, and finally try to answer the big one. Was the faith just preserved, or was it completely transformed? So let's jump right in with that foundational claim. The question really is this: was the system of belief that we call orthodoxy something that Jesus and the apostles taught? Or did it pop up as something kind of new in the centuries that followed? That's what we need to figure out. Okay, but before we can even begin to answer that, we have to get on the same page about a key term. The word orthodoxy can mean a few different things, so we need to be really clear about which definition we're using here. When you break it down, the word itself is pretty simple. It comes from two Greek words, orthos, which means right or correct, and doxa, which means belief or teaching. So put them together, and orthodoxy literally just means right belief. Easy enough, right? But right belief according to whom? Well, you can think of it in about three layers. There's the denominational one, like the Eastern Orthodox Church. Then there's a more general doctrinal meaning, just conforming to what any group believes. But for our purposes today, we're zeroing in on that first historical definition. We're talking about those core doctrines that were hammered out in the early church councils, the very beliefs that Athanasius was fighting for. All right, so if we want to know if those doctrines were truly kept, like Athanasius said, we have to go back to the source, right? We need to look at the original blueprint. So what did Christ and the apostles actually teach about God based on what we find in the Bible? What you find in the New Testament is a message that's incredibly personal. It's not about abstract philosophy. It's built on the language of family, a father, a son. The core ideas are pretty clear. God is one. Jesus is the Son of God, sent by the Father, and crucially, the Father is greater than the Son. This relational language is our baseline, our foundation. Okay, now this is where things get really interesting. As the early church started to expand, it ran into all sorts of new challenges and heated debates. And to defend what they believed, they started reaching for a totally new kind of language. And you can see that shift so clearly here. On one side, you have the original relational language of the Bible. Father, Son, simple, personal. But on the other side, you get these new philosophical terms. Words like homoousios, that's a Greek word that means of the same substance. The idea that the Father is greater gets transformed into a new doctrine of co-equal, co-eternal persons. That's not just a small tweak, that is a fundamental shift in language and concept. And this wasn't something that happened overnight. Not at all. Look at this timeline. The word Trinity, a word you won't even find in the Bible, doesn't show up until around 200 AD. Then it's another 100+ years before the Council of Nicaea introduces that key philosophical term, homoousios. And we have to wait all the way until 451 AD to get the final complex formula of Christ being one person in two natures. The point is, these core ideas were developed centuries after Jesus and the apostles. So this whole shift raises a massive question, and it's all about authority. If Jesus and the apostles never used this kind of philosophical language, who gave later church fathers like Athanasius the authority to create these brand new binding definitions of God? Well, let's look at the two sources of authority. First up, you have the apostles. Where did their authority come from? It came directly from Jesus Christ. It was a divine commission. They weren't sitting around like modern theologians. They were foundational witnesses. Their authority was based on direct revelation. Now, contrast that with Athanasius. His authority came from a totally different place. It came from his official position as a bishop, from his brilliant mind, and from his participation in these big church councils. His role wasn't to receive new revelation, but to interpret and defend the teachings that already existed. And that's the absolute crucial point. There's a fundamental difference here. The apostles' authority was rooted in revelation. Athanasius' authority was rooted in his interpretation and his ability to persuade others in church-sanctioned debates. You could say he was a theologian and a bishop, not a prophet. Okay, so this all brings us back to our big question. After looking at all this evidence, what's the verdict? Was the original faith of the apostles simply preserved, just as Athanasius claimed? Or was it transformed? Well, the conclusion from our source material is pretty stark. It basically says that the God of the creeds isn't the same relational, personal God that Christ talked about. Instead, it's a philosophical being, one that's been shaped and defined by Greek concepts and centuries of theological debate. So, when you look at it that way, the process really wasn't one of simple preservation at all. It was an active, and you could say creative, reinterpretation. The early church fathers took the core message of the apostles and, to defend it from challenges, they poured it into a new philosophical mold. And those new interpretations eventually became the official, binding doctrines of the church. And all of this leaves us with a really big question to chew on. What happens when faith becomes philosophy? What do we gain? And what might we lose when a simple, personal faith in a Father and a Son evolves into a complex philosophical system?